As people log on, we'll start in a couple seconds. We're just giving people a chance to be here. Good evening, everyone. I'm State Senator Anthony Portantino, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this important conversation around gun safety and the traumatic aftermath of many of the tragedies we've been facing in California. Very pleased to have I think, an outstanding panel to discuss this issue from very different perspectives. And so I'm going to introduce the speakers, then I'm going to say a few introductory words. And then after I speak, we're going to go to Sheriff Luna. So it's my honor to introduce all of you to our panel tonight. We have Sheriff Robert Luna, who was just recently elected as the 34th Sheriff of Los Angeles County. So first of all, congratulations, Sheriff, on this wonderful position you're in. Sheriff Luna comes to us as before the Sheriff was the Long Beach Police Department Chief, and he was a reserve officer and served in that department for over 30 years. And he's a graduate of the FBI Investigation Unit at the National Executive Institute at the National Academy, Harvard's University's Program for Senior Executives in State and Local Government, and the University of Southern California degree as well. And so we're pleased to have Sheriff Luna, who's got a master's in public administration, also from Cal State Long Beach. So thank you, Sheriff, for being here. In addition to the Sheriff, we've got Dr. Wintemute, who is the Distinguished Professor of Emergency Medicine and Baker Terrett Chair in Violence Prevention at the University of California, Davis. He is the founding director of the Violence Prevention Research Program and of California's Firearm Violence Research Center. So we all talk about data. We all talk about law enforcement. So we've got LA County's top law enforcement official, and we've got the state's preeminent researcher on gun violence and, frankly, gun safety with us. In addition, we have Dr. Leandra Clark-Harvey, who is a psychologist and chief executive officer of the California Council of Community Behavioral Health Agencies. She's also the executive director of the California Access Coalition, a group of advocacy organizations and companies that advocate for patient access and behavioral health treatment. She served as a consultant to several California state agencies and the Assembly as well. She has maintained an impressive record of leadership, serving on national and boards, including the National Council of Mental Wellbeing. She's a dynamic behavioral health expert and is going to be dealing with a lot of the trauma in the aftermath. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Harvey with us. In addition to Dr. Harvey, we have Deborah Manners, who has dedicated her career serving children, and she's currently the person who runs the Sycamores, which is a dynamic agency in Pasadena and Altadena. She began her career at the Sycamores in 1987 and now serves as its president and CEO. It has 10 service locations throughout Los Angeles County. Ms. Manners is the immediate past president of the California Council for Community Behavioral Health Agency and has served on the board of California Alliance for Children and Families. And she was previously the CEO for Council for the National Council for Strong Families and Communities. So we're looking forward to hearing her take on how we're going to deal with this traumatic effect of this gun violence that we've seen across the country and in our state, and very pleased that she's here. She also has a master's degree in social work from the University of Washington. And then our final panelist will be Wendy Wang, who is the Chief Public Policy Advocacy and Strategy Advisor at the Sycamores. And she's a champion of many of the issues critical to the success of community-based organizations, including the importance of culturally responsive and linguistically appropriate care packages, and that's very important. And I also want to add, for folks who may want to get information in Spanish, Armenian, Chinese, or Korean, You can always call my office and we can help facilitate getting necessary information to you that you need. So if you have folks, don't let language be a barrier to getting help. We have access to getting you that information as well. Wendy is also served as the president of the Price Alumni Association Board of Directors and on the board of the Asian Pacific Alumni Association. She was recognized for her dedication and years of service with the USC Alumni House and the GPAC Outstanding Alumni of the Year. And we're pleased and honored to have her with us today. So we really have a great panel to try to delve deep into gun violence and gun safety, both from a law enforcement, from a research, and from a human traumatic way. And so I was very happy that this group came together. For me, again, I'm State Senator Anthony Portantino, recently introduced SB 2 with the support of the governor and the Attorney General to make California aligned with the Bruin decision out of the Supreme Court that said we can't have arbitrary applications of our concealed carry permitting process. And so this would set a standard in place with concrete criteria, including references, monitoring folks' Facebook and social media posts to see that they don't have a violent history, making sure that they don't have felons and other disqualifying issues related to gun safety. And so that's SB 2. I was the proud author of California's open carry laws, which keep the open carry of weapons off Main Street, California. We've heard recently the talk of having safe storage on a national level. I authored California's safe storage laws, which means if you don't lock up your weapon and you allow it to fall into a prohibited person's hands, you will face legal consequences from that. And President Biden has called for that on a national level, and California is leading on that effort. Frankly, California is leading on a myriad of gun safety laws, which I know Dr. Wintemuth will walk us through, and why that's important and why it's making a difference. So I've worked with a strong coalition of activists during my career in the Assembly and the Senate to position California to make Main Street and other communities safer throughout the state. So I just want to share that with you, and we'll be delving into questions. I'm going to now turn it over to Chief Luna to give us a few comments, and then we'll go through our speakers, and then we're going to take Q&A. Up to this point, we've taken a lot of questions from the public as we publicize this. I'm going to walk through the 10 questions, series of 10 questions that we have, and then time permitting, I might go to the Q&A and see what other questions we have. And obviously the conversation that we're going to have amongst us will stimulate some more thoughts. And some of the questions are for all of the panelists and some are for the individual panelists. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Luna to give us a few comments. Excuse me, Sheriff Luna. Keep calling you Chief. Sheriff Luna.
It's okay. Both work for me, Senator, and I appreciate you taking the time to put this together. Your leadership, as you've shown over and over regarding gun safety, gun prevention, violence prevention, is you've been one of the top leaders in our state. We are here today to bring awareness to you regarding protecting our communities from crime and prevent you from becoming a victim. Crime prevention comprises strategies and measures that seek to reduce the risk of crimes occurring and their potentially harmful effects on individuals and society by intervening to influence their multiple causes. Increasing the effort and reducing the risk are the main goals. However, intelligence, intervention, involvement, and impact are key elements in reducing crime. Although we can't always stop crime from occurring entirely, we will always give it an all-out effort. It's up to our community members in LA County that if you see something, got to get involved with law enforcement to make sure that we're reporting it. Some of the efforts we have made to minimize crime rate have been transparency, which has been absolutely critical in mending the trust to the public. We still have a lot of work to do there. All statistical information is made available to the public via the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department website at lasd.org. Gun buyback programs are very important. We've been involved in those. I just met with a couple of community groups who are interested in raising money to do more of those. This allows people to surrender unwanted guns and turn and receive gift cards for groceries and other helpful necessities. In 2022, we had 2 successful gifts for gun events. These events recovered 492 guns off of our street And there's some studies out there that show that a lot of guns are taken from legal owners in burglaries, maybe home burglaries and auto burglaries. So it's very important to remember that if you do have a weapon for some reason, give it up if you don't use it through legal means, but keep it somewhere safe if you do have it, so it doesn't impact our community negatively. Patrol stations have community relations deputies assigned to target specific concerns and any challenging crime areas, but that's not only addressing crime, but working with partners or community as partners. We've also reached out to our Spanish-speaking community, for example, holding Spanish-speaking civilian academies with the mission of partnering so that people who don't speak the language and it's beyond Spanish will always feel comfortable coming forward to the police to report crimes that are occurring. They are our eyes and ears in the community. That's always important. Our youths have always been highly impacted by drugs, and that's always something we pay a whole lot of attention to. The industry station, along with narcotic detectives and medical experts, held an informative session on discussing the deadly impacts of fentanyl, for example, on our youth and how to administer Narcan. So with that, I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. There are some challenges ahead. As you know, we dealt with the tragedy in Monterey Park a couple of weeks ago that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's was very involved in. And it's frustrating when you hear these shootings, really any shootings, but mass shootings that occur. And I just repeat myself and say that the status quo right now is not working. So all of us have to step up to the plate and do our part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheriff. And obviously, we're going to continue to drill down into these concepts as the conversation goes on. And I know your department not only has to investigate these mass shootings, but when we talk about trauma, the trauma that everyone involved, the families, the victims, the first responders, the EMTs, I mean, everybody that has to deal with it has to take those issues home with them. And so we certainly understand how difficult that is for everyone, and send our love and prayers to the families who have been affected. And obviously tonight we're here to talk more about just our well wishes too. We're talking about action. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Wintemuth, who can walk us through some of the statistics and some of the data. And I'm not sure if the general public even knows that what you're doing it from a macro sense, why the legislature created the program at Davis, why it's so important. And if I might say, in Washington, they forbid this type of data from even being collected that we're collecting in California. So Dr. Wintemuth, I'm excited as well to hear from you. So thank you, sir, for being here.
So Senator, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I'm going to keep my remarks pretty brief to maximize time for questions. But as you said, I'm here to represent the position that there is a science to firearm violence, to understanding it and preventing it. Good policy is based on solid scientific evidence, and California is a state that recognizes that and is willing to help have that evidence be collected. And with that in mind, created a research center at UC Davis that I run. So I'm a researcher. I'm also a practicing ER doc. I see this from two perspectives. And let me synthesize them this way. At a time of tragedy like we are experiencing, it's tempting to believe that gun control laws don't work and to give up and feel some despair. And that is simply not true. California has a robust network of laws and regulations regarding firearms and their use. And not by coincidence, our rate of firearm homicide in California is well below the average for the country. Our rate of firearm suicide is among the lowest of the 50 states. And let me quantify this. In 2020, the first pandemic year, the rate of death from firearm violence in the rest of the country was 60% higher than it was in California. If the rest of the country had had California's firearm death rate in 2020, the nation would have saved 16,000 lives in 1 year. 1,500 of those in Texas alone, or close to. And to get a little bit more specific, we and others have evaluated individual laws to determine their impact. And you don't have to trust me for this. This is the Rand Corporation talking, that has singled out policies such as comprehensive background checks and waiting periods, minimum age requirements, setting prohibitions on firearm purchase by violent misdemeanors, and others as clearly linked to reductions in firearm violence, death from firearm violence. They've also clearly identified some policies as linked to increases in firearm death, and a permissive approach to carrying concealed weapons is among those policies. I think for now, I will stop there so we can maximize time for questions. But I would like people to understand that as all of us are suffering the grief and loss of our community members, understand that there are researchers and health professionals on the case trying to understand this problem, because it's preventable.
That's a great way to go into the next segment on the trauma, because that's our frustration. These tragedies are preventable. And unfortunately, we're not nationwide preventing as many as we can and should. And we're left with dealing with the aftermath, the pain, the suffering, the death, the tragedy. And so, Dr. Harvey, if you could touch upon the aftermath of these and how, I mean, I know I received many questions and comments on Facebook and from others, you know, just my kids are afraid to go to school, or how do we deal as a family? So if you could talk a little bit about the trauma and how you and your organization and how therapists and behavioral health folks are helping people cope and deal.
Well, thank you, Senator. I'm happy to talk about that, as well as share a little bit about the work that our members do and to provide some recommendations as well. So thank you to you and my co-presenters for your leadership on this tough but critical issue. The founder of our association authored the Mental Health Services Act, and that enables the mental health and substance use disorder clinics that we represent to provide care annually to over 1 million Californians throughout the state. And we know that 50% of Americans experience a mental health condition at some point in their life. And the work that our members do enables so many of these individuals to cope with trauma associated with a variety of societal issues, including gun violence. But we need to be clear about the true relationship between gun violence and mental illness. Gun violence, as we've all shared, is a national public health crisis, and it impacts everyone. And since the 60s, the number and lethality of guns and mass shootings has skyrocketed. We lose 8 children to gun violence a day. Despite what you may see in the news, though, mental illness is not the cause of most gun violence, and the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent. And actually, they're more likely to be victims of gun violence. But what we do know is that mental illness is linked to suicide by gun. Many individuals who die by suicide who have had exposure to violent and traumatic events earlier in their lives, often during their childhood and youth. And this exposure can cause lasting changes in the nervous system, the way people think and act and react, if it's not treated early. So we know that violence, especially early and frequent exposure, can cause trauma, and some may turn to poor coping mechanisms, including self-harm or suicide. And for many others, just being continually bombarded with news about community violence can desensitize us to the gravity of these constant assaults, or may cause stress and anxiety. And it's unsettling. One study found that after mass shootings are publicized, that gun sales actually increase due to a fear amongst the general public. But we have to remember, it's not dangerous, mentally ill people that cause gun violence. Rather, it's dangerous weapons that cause gun violence. Children who are exposed to gun violence may experience negative and short-term psychological effects, including anger, withdrawal, post-traumatic stress, and desensitization to violence. And certain children may be at higher risk for negative outcomes if they're exposed to gun violence. The groups they identified in a study include children injured in gun violence, those who witnessed violent acts at close proximity, and those exposed to high level of violence in their communities, their schools, and those exposed to violent media. So based on all of these findings that I've summarized for you, I'd like to share some recommendations about what we can do at the individual and the systems level to cope with gun violence and the impact of trauma. So let me share my screen quickly. As you can see here, recommendations include being very careful about how we sensationalize the media. It can be so interesting to watch TV and to dial in and watch things over and over again. But sensationalizing gun violence can actually encourage folks to participate, and they can look for that when they enact violent acts. We also need to make sure that we take a media break, whether that's you, your family, your children. Walk away from the TV, turn it on, focus on family and each other, monitor your youth's exposure to violence on TV. This can negatively impact how folks are coping and activities, and also making sure that we are funding the appropriate programs. So peer-to-peer programs in schools and in community settings are very important to teach youth how to recognize the signs and symptoms of a behavioral health crisis. So oftentimes we see crises and we say, oh, a friend had heard about this, or maybe they were posting something on their social media. Maybe they wrote a letter or a note to a friend. We need to make sure that we are equipping children with what they need so that they can help each other heal and help each other get in contact with adults who can be helpful. Public health campaigns are also very important, providing that education to everyone about the different ways that trauma can impact us and how to stay safe. And then also when we think about gun shop owners and shooting range employees, providing them what they need to recognize folks that may be at propensity for committing suicide or harm, they too need training. And then obviously investing in crisis services. So whether that's 988 or community training like mental health first aid, all of these things taken together can help impact how individuals cope with traumatic events moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. Obviously, that's the key, is what can we do to reduce the stress early on, and then obviously deal with it after the tragedy occurs, which is, as you pointed out, far too often. And we don't want people to become so desensitized to the situation that they throw up their hands or they, find it difficult to function. So thank you. We're going to go to Debbie Manners, a licensed clinical social worker who runs the Sycamores, and get a further perspective on how this is affecting families. And in particular, we're also going to hear about foster youth and other families. So Debbie, and please share.
Thank you. So listening to what we've heard tonight, what we see at Sycamores with the kids and the families that we've been working with is that the greater the exposure to gun violence, the trauma or the wounds that the children experience over time, it kind of normalizes that violent behavior. Youth most at risk are those who live or have lived in communities that are economically challenged, or where family violence and community violence is so frequent. Many of those youth are disproportionately children of color. Many of these youth are foster youth. California has more foster youth than any other state. And what we frequently hear from older adolescent youth are words of hopelessness. This past year, I had the opportunity to meet with a foster youth that was receiving mental health services from us at the Sycamores. He had recently been involved in an incident where he had a gun and he was brandishing it to the police. When I asked him, why would you do something like that? Didn't you think you might get shot or killed? His response to me was, I'm going to be dead before I'm 20. Unfortunately, these feelings of hopelessness are shared by many adolescents and young adults who live in homes and communities where they hear gunshots at night and where they witness violence in schools, churches, concert halls, dance studios, and malls. Gun violence is so pervasive that in the last year, our staff who provide mental health services to more than 1,300 students in public schools across the county have experienced an increase in students sharing with them that there is an accessible gun in their home. The students come to them because they are scared that someone in their home may use it, or scared that they may need to use it to protect themselves. Statistically, as Leandra said, we know that an accessible gun in the home increases the risk for suicide for the children and the adolescents living in that home. How children function as individuals is really determined about their relationships with their family, the larger group, and the community. Who they become as an adult is a result of what they believe about themselves. So illness and well-being are kind of a manifestation of their social context. So what is the social context that our children are growing up in? Evidence shows that children who are repeatedly exposed to trauma develop adverse reactions, such as physical illness, addiction, mental illness, and criminal behavior. So what we have recently witnessed in this country, which has been handicapping us, is denial of science and evidence. So my response is, you've heard from the doctor about the evidence, you know about the trauma. My concern is that, are we all going to make this normal?
I hope not. I hope not. I think hope is probably one of the most important words. So thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that. Wendy, you want to add to that conversation?
Sure. I'll just add really quickly. We've heard a lot from all four panelists, and it's heavy and dense. In fact, it could be somewhat bleak. And if I were honest, there's part of me that's still grappling with this fear that the high-profile incidents that we've seen in January, I wonder, frankly, if it's going to continue in the foreseeable future. And maybe that's just me. I'm not sure. But I also agree that doing nothing is unacceptable with what we've seen so far. And so where do we go from here? I think the Senator, you talked about hope. And I think where we go from here depends on how we fundamentally answer this question. Are we collectively committed to a future where our young children, young people, as they become adults, are going to be high functioning and thriving in society, and they're able to reach their full potential and not overwhelmed by the grief, the unspeakable loss, and the lingering effects of gun violence and trauma? If our answer is yes, and we are embracing this collective vision for our future, which I believe Senator Portantino has already led the way in redoubling his commitment to aggressively address and end gun violence for this generation. And I'm just going to stop there. I know we've talked already about policy levers, but maybe we can continue that discussion during Q&A.
And I'm going to shake things up a little bit with the Q&A, because interestingly, obviously in the Q&A of this panel, there's a lot of folks saying, show us the data, questioning the science. Well, aren't you hearing from the other side? But here's the thing. If you ask those questions, you should be open to the answer. And so, Dr. Wintemuth, I'm going to come back to you again. Walk us through the data, the facts. You know, there's a difference between rhetoric and facts. And drill down on the data, on the statistics of why the proliferation of weapons in the general public's hands leads to an unsafe neighborhood, not a safe neighborhood. And again, I said that rhetorically. Dr. Wintemuth put it into factual context. And those folks who are asking the questions, here is the answer.
Thank you, Senator. So there's a terrible irony to this, in the answer to your question. People buy guns more for protection than for all other reasons put together. So anytime fear increases, gun sales go up. That's not a paradox, that's predicted. They spike after mass shootings. We're actually, as we follow these data monthly, we're just finishing, it appears, a 3-year surge in gun purchasing nationwide, which started in January of 2020 as we saw a pandemic coming and concern about disruption and so on. And then the pandemic arrived, and I won't tell the whole story, but for one reason or another, we acquired firearms at a rate far higher than predicted by our history. There are somewhere on the order of 400 million guns in civilian hands in the United States.
400 million.
Yes, sir. We have more guns than we have people, and those guns are not going away. So let me add to that that one of the best established facts about the relationship between firearms and violence is that ease of access to a firearm is associated with an increase in risk of firearm death. That's been measured at, if you will, the population level, comparing countries with high and low rates of gun ownership. It's been measured within the United States, comparing states with high and low rates of gun ownership. But probably most importantly, that's been measured at the individual level, because it's at the individual level that the decision to make a gun occurs. Bringing a gun into a home that does not have guns in it prior to that moment increases by a factor of 3 to 5, 300% to 500% risk of suicide for the owner and risk of homicide for the other people who live in the home. In the first weeks after that gun is brought into the home, risk of suicide for the owner goes up by a factor of 100, by 10,000%. And to the best of our knowledge, that risk never goes back down to what it was before. So the terrible irony is that something terrible happens, people get scared, they buy guns, homes that didn't have guns now do, and that cycle tends to reinforce higher rates of gun violence in the United States, including more frequent mass shootings, and those events lead to more gun ownership, and you can see the vicious cycle that I'm talking about. But let me flip. Sheriff Luna made reference to something that I'm going to restate because you can't hear it often enough. If you see something, say something. Firearm violence is preventable. Here in California, at any given moment in time, 1 adult in 8, about 12% of the population, knows at least one person that they think is at risk of harming themselves or somebody else. That's millions of people. And we need to be willing, when we have that information, to step up and be the kind of hero who brings that information to somebody who can do something about it, whether it's a mental health professional, a law enforcement professional, a health professional. We don't have to sit back and watch the train wreck over and over and over again. Each one of us can do something to make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Wintemuth. Those are staggering statistics. Sheriff, obviously, from a law enforcement perspective, cooperation is important. There's 88 cities in LA County that contract with the Sheriff's Department. There are independent law enforcement agencies. Pasadena has its own police department, Burbank, Glendale. There's state, federal, local agencies. Can you talk about how cooperation across all the law enforcement segments helps? And also, if I didn't say I was going to ask this question, any suggestions you have for further legislation to help on stemming gun violence out there? If you have any thoughts you want to share. I know that was a curveball and I apologize, but I told you all that I would think of things as we went along. So if you want to talk about cooperation as a tool, and then if you have any other thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating conversation. And I start the conversation by saying this, that the status quo is not working here with what's going on. we've got to be better than this. When kids are afraid to go to school, when you're afraid to go to a public place because you think nowadays that you hear, fireworks going off or backfire, that you're looking for the places close for cover is not good. Collaboration in law enforcement is absolutely critical in what we do. And it's not only collaboration at the local level with the other agencies in Los Angeles County, but it is working with the State Attorney General's office. As a police chief in Long Beach, we were very proactive in working with them with their prohibitive possessor program, meaning individuals who are not supposed to own guns, who maybe had them, and then we proactively investigate and make sure we get the guns out of people who have committed domestic violence, who are deemed to be 5150 or mentally ill. Being assertive in those kind of task forces that we can work together with the AG, and then working with our federal partners at the ATF, the FBI, with the DEA. I think there'll be a question here about transporting either weapons or high capacity magazines across state lines. From that perspective, we're continuously working with our other law enforcement partners because we're sharing information, we're sharing intelligence, who may be involved. And this is very focused enforcement on just individuals that we get information from our community that we find out may be selling firearms or doing straw purchases or selling ghost guns. All those have become problematic for us here in Los Angeles County.
Thank you. Folks have suggested that, obviously we know the 10-day background check works, right? Dr. Wintermuth, we know it's effective. Folks have sent in some questions about strengthening that background check, making sure that databases talk to each other, that we capture things across different databases. Whether somebody did something at, when they were 18 and now they're 50 and they go get the gun, does the database from the 18-year-old talk to the database of the 50-year-old? Sheriff, do you have any thoughts on the data aspect of it, and whether there's some improvements we can make to that? And again, that was a question that was not, you didn't know that was coming, but it's just been pressing. And so if you have any thoughts on that, and maybe Dr. Wintermuth, you might have a thought on that as well.
Yeah, from law enforcement, getting, for example, grants from the state or federal government that would improve our technology to improve our ability to gain data. I'm a data-driven person, so listening to the doctor right before I came up and really focused in on those areas where we can, again, collaborate to work with people in law enforcement and other non-governmental agencies to make sure that we're identifying individuals who should not have any access to weapons. And that's key. You asked earlier, I didn't really answer the legislation. It's financial support and limiting more access to people who should not have guns. And then for even the legal owners of guns, which I respect legal ownership, but at the same time, enforcing our laws when it comes to the storage of weapons. I think we have to really focus on that because, as I stated earlier, a lot of the guns that are used in violent crime are taken from home and auto burglaries from legal gun owners.
Right. I think 67% of the mass shooters get their weapons from a family member. Dr. Wintermuth, you might be able to correct me on that, but I've heard that statistic. So you're right. And California does have safe storage requirements, and there are consequences if you let your gun fall into the wrong hands. And so, we need to increase that penalty. I think would be prudent. And the part of SB 2 is to make sure that you have 3 character references, that you haven't been posting on Facebook and other social media, violent tendencies. We're looking at the person from a holistic perspective. Because again, the Supreme Court said you can't deny everybody CCW, and you're allowed to have concrete criteria. So we're trying to codify that. Dr. Wintermuth, you want to add anything on the prior question? And then I'll open it up to the other panelists on some other questions.
Sure, I'll be really brief. Waiting periods work in two ways: cooling off, and they work. But the other is they allow for background checks to be conducted. Background checks work, but they're only as good as the data on which they are run. Reporting is voluntary. California does a pretty good job. Many other states, not so much. And there are federal agencies who are required to report who don't do it anyway. There have been mass shootings, let alone other events that have occurred because a prohibited person bought firearms from a retailer who had a background check run, and the prohibiting events were not in the data. We're going to be suffering from that problem for a long time. We need better data, excuse me, in order for the background checks to work better. Most mass shooters, or at least close to majority, acquire their guns legally. I think 2/3 of them acquire legally, not necessarily from families. Where family acquisition is really important is where the shooter is a child. There, the number approaches 80%. Whether it's a suicide or a school shooting where a child is the shooter, the gun came from home.
Great, thank you. For our other panelists, obviously, something that's tangential to this, just violence and intensity of our communities in general. We've seen such a rise in hate crimes, in hateful rhetoric, in Asian hate, in anti-Semitism, racism. Just seems like there's this, exponential increase of this harmful, hateful rhetoric. What can we offer folks in regard to that? What's some positive thoughts that we can share and some strategies? It just breaks my heart that here we are in 2023 and there's so much hateful rhetoric out there. What can we do as a community, as people, as loving, caring individuals? And Deborah or Wendy or Leandra, who want all three of you, please comment on that and share some thoughts.
Well, Senator, I want to thank you for alluding to the increased hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian Americans. As you are aware, there's been quite a rise in the last 2 years, according to the Stop AAPI Hate database. It's tallied more than 11,000 reports of anti-Asian American and Pacific Islander hate incidents since they began tracking in March of 2020. I think that as a result of that, there's been, as we've seen in the community, increased anxiety. I'll just share a quick story about my own family. I was sharing with Deborah the other day that the anxiety has been so overwhelming, particularly in the aftermath of the Monterey Park shootings, that I had a conversation with my parents about our fear about not doing simple things like going to the grocery store, wondering if we're going to be targeted. That was also true in the aftermath of the church shooting shortly before. And my parents and I, when we talk about church and think about church, I personally will have to think about where I sit at church now. And I think it goes to the larger point that Deborah mentioned about it's become normalized in our society, and that is tragic. I think in terms of kind words or thoughts, I think part of it is just this forum and also this recognition that in the absence of not saying anything against hate, hate fuels more hate. And we have a moral responsibility amongst all individuals as a collective society to be able to speak out in support of acceptance and tolerance and to promote hope. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Wendy. And I was struggling for even the right words to ask the question. Thank you. It's a powerful conversation, and I appreciate you sharing your personal family stories, because when you think about going to church, it should be a positive thought, not a, stop and worry thought, of all places. So thank you. Deborah, Leandra, you popped your
Sure.
microphone on.
Sure. I would say, this pandemic has become our new modern day civil rights movement. And it's truly impacted all of us. And these hate crimes and the presence of hate and the acting out that we've seen, it isn't new, but the attention that folks are paying to it, I would say, is much more focused. And I think a lot of that is because we were, for much of the pandemic, kind of shut in, and people paid attention in a different way. The silver lining, I think, though, of the pandemic is that we've seen so much more empathy, especially around mental illness, due to the fact that we were shut in. And I think it made people realize, wow, I'm a person without a diagnosable mental illness, and I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling depressed and I'm engaging in poor coping. For someone that already was prone to those different mechanisms and behaviors, how much worse could it be for them? So I do appreciate the empathy and the focus on mental illness. And I think in the end, we need to remember that we are all somebody's loved one, and we have much more in common than we have differences. And I think if we keep holding on to that unites us, that'll help us move together collectively towards a solution.
Great, thank you. Deborah, do you want to add anything?
My only comment is around what Leandra just said, is that we are so much more alike than we are different. And that when we come together as a collective, we can do so much more positive for each other than when we separate ourselves. And so just encourage people to be kind to everybody. It's so important to be kind.
Right. Kind, I always say your parents taught us those values for a reason. We need to use them as we become adults. So thank you for that. Sheriff, obviously, training, this is, training and new approaches to policing. I know Glendale has hired a social worker, doing some sort of alternative policing, reimagining how we interface. Obviously, there's the population of that have behavioral health challenges out there. Every situation is unique. How do you see law enforcement's role with the rise of anti-Semitism, the hatred, and just also the dealing with a population of folks out there who have behavioral health needs? Are you looking at some of the training going forward and some different methods? I know that's important to you, so I want to give you a chance to sort of talk about that, because I think one of the things that we don't always talk about the law enforcement component and what's out there. So if you want to share on that, I think this would be good for people to hear.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm going to be packing tonight because I'm going to DC for the rest of the week, where I'll be spending it with the Major City Chiefs Association, where we are sharing best practices, whether we're talking about shootings, we're talking about hate crimes, or we're talking about reform in policing. All those issues will be discussed. Regarding hate crimes, they're sickening. I mean, to think that somebody beats up an elderly person and you fill in the race just because they're a different race, it is just awful. And you talk about parenting. We've got to put out public messaging that what you say out loud, what you say to your kids, actually has an impact on these hate crimes we're talking about, and then holding the whole ecosystem accountable. And what I mean by that is not only policing, but our prosecutors and our courts, to make sure that when the hate crimes occur, that there are enhancements, and we stick to those enhancements, because we've got to send a strong message that that is unacceptable. The other question about alternative responses and mentally ill, I'm a huge fan of looking at policing in a very different way. We did it in Long Beach. At the end of my tenure there, where we brought in the Long Beach Health Department, and they were trying a pilot program which had a mental health nurse and a public nurse that would go out and handle lower level calls that didn't involve violence. These calls are, you got to always be careful because they're so unpredictable. But what we do now in policing is not sustainable. Our mental health care system is completely broken. For a deputy or a police officer in the street, when they run into a client or a community member who's suffering from mental illness, the options they have of how to provide the best services are limited. And it's usually only Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. So we do need to work very hard together to make sure we're looking at different ways of responding and bringing in other professionals other than just law enforcement and fire officials who can actually help people 24/7, 365 days. But yeah, law enforcement, we've evolved and we're always looking for better ways of handling it. But I'm going to just be honest with you. We can't do this by ourselves. Compare our mental health system to where it was 40 years ago to where it is now. Got a lot of work to do. We got to do it together.
And, you know, I appreciate you putting it in that context because I think people need to hear that. I know our behavioral health folks will appreciate this. One of our challenges is we're not producing enough behavioral health therapists, support system where we need for, so if anybody's out there looking for a great career that makes a difference, we need more social workers. We need more behavioral health therapists. We need more MFTs. We need more just for the sheriff's department to implement these progressive approaches. We need people who can take those jobs. And so there are jobs waiting for you and there's a need. So if you're thinking about what to do with your lives, this is a way to help people and help society. And we just can't produce enough folks fast enough. Right, Deborah, Wendy, and Leandra, you need more allies so we can help.
Do.
Yeah. So
I want to take this time to reinforce what was said about the need for response, for crisis response. So just to give a plug for 988, for those of you who don't know what that is, if you or one of your loved ones is experiencing a mental health crisis or you have concerns about someone, instead of calling 911, call 988. There's a call center. The calls will be picked up. If the other person on the phone is unable to work through the issue with the caller, then we are dispatched. Sycamore's team is dispatched. And on that team, we have someone with lived experience, a peer support person. And we also have a licensed clinician who will come to your home. Oftentimes, if the individual's unhoused, we will find them. And what is so great about this team, these teams, is we only hospitalize about 17% of all of our calls. So we're able to do the stability that is needed at the time in the home. And we're able to connect the individuals to resources so that they will have continued support. And we follow up to just make sure that they've made that connection. And whatever they need, they can call us. We give them our resources. If they're unhoused, we're able to put their belongings in our vans. If they have pets, we're able to shelter them at local animal shelters. So I just want to give a pitch for 988. Call 988 instead of 911.
That's great. No, I'm glad you did that. So today we introduced, interestingly, as we led up to this discussion, we got a lot of questions about special needs students and the population. And we've been working on a bill related to schools having plans for their special needs students, making sure that, when we do drills, when we plan within the IEP process, that schools evaluate the special needs of someone who, can't move as quickly as other students or orient as quickly as other students, make sure that emergency plans. What can you guys share of how we've been dealing with the unique needs of the special needs population in relation to gun violence and preparedness? Do you any of you have any comments on that? We're going to ask schools to include it in their IEP, and so that was crossed today. But any other thoughts on our special needs population and how we can help them through this?
Well, I can just add.
I was surprised that we got so many questions on that subject. I shouldn't be surprised because obviously family members love those, special kids with all of their heart, but we got a lot of questions. So if anybody wants to talk about that.
Well, I do think it's important to have standardized procedures, and it may be through legislation. Because if you look at how schools are treating the active shooter training or how they're providing perimeter support, it's all over the map, right?
Right.
And it really has to do with the resources that the schools have. So the private schools have far more resources than some of the public schools. And so there needs to be some standardization and accountability for how those services are provided, how the training happens, who receives the training, how frequently, and then the special needs population needs to be addressed, particularly those who are most vulnerable because they're mobile.
They're mobile. Leandra, you want to add anything on that?
I completely agree with what Deborah shared around the training being standardized. I think what we see across the state is just like we have 58 different counties, we've got lots of schools and lots of school districts and, boards and how they deal with things. Schools should all have safety plans. One thing that I think is missing though is that training specific for personnel within those schools is what sometimes is lacking. Not just a plan that gets stored somewhere on a shelf, one that is really, like Deborah said, standardized and that folks are really engaged with, understand, and enacting. And I think along with that training, it makes me think about the need for training of school personnel to also recognize trauma in kids. We have a lot of requirements in schools. There's a lot of required training for personnel. First aid, CPR, et cetera, sexual harassment training, but there's nothing mandated for mental health treatment or how to make an appropriate referral to mental health treatment if you're a school personnel individual. And I think that it's so important. And Senator, you've really led the way with prior legislation in this area. And so we know that we have a need here. We know that schools can do more. They can decide which types of trainings that they put on. We feel that, they need to be mandated to include a more robust set of trainings, safety as well as mental wellness and well-being amongst the school climate.
We're gonna fix that, right, Leandra?
We'll keep trying. Yes.
We're gonna keep trying. And I tell the story about that dad who always testifies about his 14-year-old daughter who handed in her English assignment and got an A on her assignment, and then 2 weeks later took her own life. And no one saw the warning signs of suicide in her journal because nobody was trained. And God bless that father who said, I'm not mad at the teacher. I'm not mad at folks for not recognizing it because they weren't trained. But he said, going forward, we need to make sure that folks are trained to see those warning signs. And so we're going to keep working on that. Right, Leandra?
Yeah, thank you.
So we've got a lot of questions about AR-15s. There are many Californians who don't know they are illegal in California, right, Dr. Wintemuth? They are illegal in California.
The simple answer is there's a California legal version of the AR, but it's different from ARs that are legal elsewhere.
Right. Can you explain that for folks?
I'll take a stab. I might need the sheriff's backup on this, but we first set restrictions on AR type weapons in 1989, and those restrictions have been tightened progressively since. So what was legal in 1989 is not legal now. What's legal now for purchase is a weapon that does not have a detachable magazine. In prior years, detachable magazines were allowed with some technical differences from year to year. You can still buy a gun that looks like an AR, but it's not the kind of gun that you would buy in Nevada or Arizona.
And because the magazine is high capacity, and so that's why those are not legal?
Well, if I recall correctly, the fixed magazine that now comes on a California AR holds 10 rounds. And you can't exceed that. The box is part of the gun. The whole problem was that you could put in a magazine. We could set a ban on high capacity magazines, but the weapons would still accept them if you had one. Now, the weapon cannot, there's no opportunity to put in a separate magazine. It's 10 rounds and done.
Right.
The doctor, just real quick, the doctor doesn't need any help. He nailed it.
We also highly regulate ammunition in California. I know folks have asked that question, probably not as much as we should. I saw you raise your eyebrows, Dr. Wintermuth, so there's probably room to do more on ammunition.
Eyebrows give me away all the time. So we have a background check process for ammunition, which is a huge improvement. I'd like to tell the story of how it came about. We don't set limits on quantity. So you had to go through a background check to buy a gun, but there was no comparable process for ammunition. And
where folks can call and get help from folks that are trained in how to deal with a mental health and a substance use disorder issue that's happening. Community training is really important. So I know, Senator, you're very supportive of mental health first aid and other training programs that allow folks that aren't mental health professionals, churches, community groups, families, to get resources so they know how to respond if they notice a behavioral health issue with their friends and family and community members. And if you have no access to anything else at all, you can call 211. Call 211 and ask for help. They will direct you to where you can go. So again, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion and to focus and highlight mental illness and how that intersects and many times doesn't intersect with gun violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Leandra. Wendy, you want to go next?
Sure. I also want to thank you, Senator, for your leadership and your courage for hosting this first, I'm sure, of many conversations. Thank you so much for all the other panelists. I've learned so much just in our 1 hour conversation today. And like Dr. Clark Harvey, I also grew up in an era where I didn't have to worry about active shooter drills. I worried about earthquakes. And so I can't imagine what it would be like raising children in today's times. And I do want to share some resources, I think, in one of the pre-submitted questions. So I want to call out, there are a lot of wonderful resources for families and caregivers, mental health first aid. I know Sycamores, thanks to SAMHSA funding, we will be helping to do training for law enforcement officials, community leaders, faith-based leaders. I'm also going to be signed up to do some of those trainings. Other organizations, grassroots organizations like the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Southern California, they do bystander intervention trainings. I've also taken that training. It's in English and other API languages. So I think that's important in terms of accessibility and reaching underserved and high impacted communities. There's also for educators and teachers and administrators, resources posted on the National Association of School Psychologists. I know, Senator, that your staff will be sharing a list of these resources on your website. So I just wanted to flag that for those in the audience who may like more information.
Thank you. Deborah?
I just want to say, I think it's important that the adults realize that the kids are watching and that we need to make sure that we keep them safe. And in these circumstances, if they were all of these kids were our own kids, I think that's the mindset that we need to take, because it is about safety. And what we know is that kids who do not live in safe environments are often the grown-ups that commit the crimes. So comment on a personal note. I have a grandchild who was going to start kindergarten. And the first thing I did is I went on Google Maps to see if there was a perimeter fence. But thank you, Senator. You've been amazing in your support of children's mental health and bringing this conversation to light. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I mean, it used to be you would look to see how big the sports field was, and now we're looking to see if there's a perimeter fence. I mean, how society has changed. Thank you for sharing that. Garen, you have a last thought you want to share with us?
I do. I grew up in school with duck and cover drills when missiles were coming from overseas, and now people do duck and cover for missiles coming from down the hall and through the door. We really have changed. We're the country that has where people make escape plans when they go to the mall, as has been discussed. That notwithstanding, I'm optimistic because there is a growing awareness that firearm violence is not acceptable. There's also, and this conversation tonight manifests it, a growing awareness that there's a limit, particularly in a place like California, to what you can do on firearm violence if all you do is focus on firearms. And I say that as somebody who spent most of my career focusing on firearms. But we've spent a lot of our time tonight focusing on the things that drive violence. We are not inherently a more violent society in the United States. What sets us apart is our unique level of access to a technology that changes the outcome of the center.
Thank you. And Chief, I know you have to run to another meeting. You want to give a last comment?
Yeah, back in the day before Halloween in 2019, when I was the chief of police in Long Beach, we made national news because 12 people were shot. It wasn't considered a mass shooting because 3 people passed away, which is interesting that, one number puts it off to a mass shooting or not. But I remember a young lady whose spinal cord was severed. She lived, and what an amazing young lady. But I remember hugging parents who just sent their kids off to a Halloween party and never saw them again. Mass shooting in Monterey Park. If I could only express to you the pain that I saw there. I'm tired of this. We've got to stop reporting on these type of incidences, but we say it over and over. I'm actually more of a moderate person, and I think we need to find a moderate approach to getting somewhere where we just stop throwing rocks at each other and realize that we can't have another massacre like we did at Uvalde or other schools like mentioned here before, where we're worried about fences around our schools. We just need to do much better than we've been doing, ladies and gentlemen. We really need to change our perspectives.
Thank you for that, Sheriff, and thank you everybody to different services. Obviously, this conversation will be available on my website. So it's the Senate District 25.senate.ca.gov, or just Google Anthony Portantino Senator and you'll get to the website. There's also going to be resources. Wendy alluded to the California Health and Human Services Agency and the California Department of Aging put together resource documents for communities struggling after the Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay tragedies. The Crisis Recovery Resource Guide has been posted on the website as well. So there's availabilities. Also, you can call my office if you need help in different languages. We'll try to help you navigate there. We were going to have a language app associated with this, but it didn't come together. So I do apologize for that. But I want to thank you all for being here. I think it was a great conversation, and we will keep working hard both on the mental health side, the sensible gun safety. Dr. Wintermuth, keep putting those statistics out there because people need to hear them. Dr. Harvey, we're going to continue to try to train more health professionals to give you more help. And, you know, Deborah and Wendy, you know, thank you for helping those populations that need our help the most. This has been I learned a lot tonight and just feel invigorated. That word hope can send their kids off to school and have them come home safe and sound. And so thank you everybody for being here. This will be available for folks to share as we go forward. So everybody have a good night tonight. I also want to thank my staff and everybody who helped work in concert and all your staffs for putting this on. They all did a great job, but this didn't happen just by accident. And so the Senate staff and my personal staff and all your staffs that worked together to make it happen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.